Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for braving the cold weather to join us for this event today. My name is Jonathan Isaby. I'm the Director of the Growth Commission. Welcome to all of you here, and indeed welcome to everyone who is watching on YouTube after the event, because we are filming, so be aware of that. The Growth Commission, as I hope you are aware, is a body of 13 international non-partisan economists who model the effect of policy and fiscal proposals on GDP per capita. There they are in all their glory. Shankar, the chairman, Shankar Singham, is alas unable to be with us today, but conveys his good wishes to everybody. But they're a superbly expert bunch of people. They come from Britain, the United States, Japan, Mexico, and India. And their modelling is particularly important because it analyses the dynamic impact of policy changes, whereas so much of the modelling that's done in Whitehall, the very unreliable modelling done in Whitehall, is static and doesn't take into account the dynamic changes, which is why our work is so important. We're here today for the launch of our 2025 growth budget. This is our third growth budget, and that means that you can actually now start to look back at previous work that the Commission has put out, look at what the government did or didn't do based on what the Commission said, and make judgments as to whether the government made the right decisions or not. And I leave you to make those judgments. I also have out on the chair's view a copy of a paper we published in September, which was about growth in Europe, which was authored primarily by Ewen Stewart, which we launched in Paris as an event in September, which is still available to watch on our YouTube channel. I thought you might appreciate a copy of that. And it was around the time of the launch of that we launched our International Advisory Board, which are 6 former national leaders: Tony Abbott from Australia, Peter Nekas from the Czech Republic, Sebastian Kurz from Austria, Janusz Jęca from Slovenia, Mateusz Morawiecki from Poland, and Liz Truss, the former British Prime Minister, who I'm delighted to say is with us today. Also, want to give you a date for your diaries. Monday, the 23rd of March next year, we're going to be co-hosting a conference with the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. And it's going to be a one-day conference focused on how to rescue the British economy. It'll be held at the Vinson Centre at the University of Buckingham. You are all invited. We will obviously be sending out formal invitations to our mailing list in due course, but you are literally the first people to know about that, and you will all be very welcome there. So, on to today's event. Commissioners Ewen Stewart and Douglas McWilliams are going to be presenting the growth budget and then taking your questions afterwards. I'm happy to hand over to Ewen.
Good morning, and thank you very much indeed. It's a great privilege to be here and present the Growth Commission's budget, which I managed to fall on the floor, but we picked it up. So, I find it extraordinary that at the start of my career, this country was one of the most successful, not just in Europe, but in the world. We were an open economy. We were a fairly low tax economy. Our public debt figures were low and very strong in a European context. It was a fair society, actually. And we had a strong private sector, which was 2/3 of the economy. The state sector was roughly 1/3 of the economy. And I think it's fair to say we were the envy of Europe. There are many other stats I could give you. The pension funds in this country were bigger than all Europe combined. That's just one stat. There's lots more we could go into later. And I contrast that with what we see today. Left and right agree this country is in a shocking state of repair in every sense, economically, liberally, and culturally. But if we have a look at this chart here, it just shows you how far Britain is sinking. It was one of the richest countries in the world when Tony Blair took office, and it has lost at least 10 places And on our trajectory, looking at what has happened in the last few years, we are going to be, on our calculations, poorer than Poland by 2034. Extraordinary statistic. Communist Poland has come from a desperate situation a generation ago to virtually catching us. And more shockingly, Turkey by 2043, and on current trends, Malaysia by 2051. Britain is moving, just as Argentina, literally as Argentina, 100 years ago, from one of the most prosperous and tolerant places in the world to quite a serious and dark place. And we're going to go through in this presentation why we think that has happened and what we think the government urgently has to do to rectify that. The good news is I don't think it's too late. I think this country still has enough positive assets. It's got a City of London, it's got cultural assets, it's got sporting assets, it has good people, it's got elite education, it had the rule of law. We can regain these things, but it's getting very close to the last chance saloon, and we must act very quickly. But just bear in mind how far this country is sinking down the global league tables. And this is a problem, it's not an advanced problem. To say that, well, we're rich, others will inevitably catch up, that isn't true. This is a British problem, and it's a European problem, as we showed in Paris recently. British growth in the last 20 years has been half that of the OECD average, half that of America, and about a third that of Australia. Other wealthy countries are performing well. We are not. And I would say it is down to the extreme growth of the state, increase in taxation, increase in public debt, an extraordinary increase in regulation. Britain has become regulation central of the world, and we need to do something about that, and pretty urgently. So Britain is changing very rapidly. 20 years ago, the majority of our exports were goods. Today, about 4 years ago, actually, was the tipping point where we started to export more services than goods. That's not a bad thing in itself. There's a lot of value added in exports. But what you'll note, actually, is since Brexit, exports in services have actually increased above trend line. People will say Britain's failure is down to leaving the European Union in 2016 or ultimately 2020. That is an eccentric perspective. It's eccentric for a number of reasons. The data shows that our services trade is strong. The data shows that Britain's growth, miserable as it's been, is about as miserable as Europe's. It's not worse than Europe's. But not only that, Britain has become more European. It's increased taxation to European levels. It's increased debt to European levels, more than in many cases. And it's out-Europe the EU in terms of regulation. So Britain is transitioning towards a service economy and changing very rapidly. Monetary policy. Doug is going to speak about the MPC and the OBR a little later. I'll leave that honour to him. But what I would say is that we've lived through a period of unstable prices in the last few years, and that continues. Our inflation in this country at 3.8% is currently the highest in the G8. If we rail back to the COVID period, the money printing program, in my view, was directly responsible for inflation peaking out at 11%. The establishment blamed the war in Ukraine and supply side issues. The truth of the matter is inflation was already at 6-7% before those tragic events. But what is even more extraordinary is the groupthink in the MPC. They didn't even look at broad money, or if they did, it was a cursory look. So we strongly believe that they need to learn the lessons and not just fall into their Keynesian groupthink. And they need to have if they believe in diversity, diversity means bringing in other ideas into the MPC. It means looking at Austrian economics. It means looking at monetarist economics and broad money in particular. So, public spending. Britain is spending about 1.4 trillion in its public sector. What does 1.4 trillion mean? It means dividing simply by 29 million homes, we're spending £48,000 per family. Hands up, who thinks they're getting £48,000 worth? I see no hands. It's extraordinary. Even on the OBR, even if you believe the OBR's numbers, and frankly, we don't, but even if we do believe their numbers, on their numbers, public spending is over 200 billion higher in real terms than it was when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. And on their numbers, it will be 300 billion higher by the time this miserable government leaves office in hopefully 2 or 3 years' time. These are extraordinary sums. When Tony Blair became Prime Minister, the state was a third of the economy, roughly. It's just under half the economy, and in many parts of the country, it's well over 50%. I think of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the north of England, parts of the Midlands, it's over half. That is the sort of level of state that Poland had under the Soviet Union. Our proposals to cut 105 billion, I'm quite sure those from the Resolution Foundation will say it can't be done. They're mad, they'll say. 105 billion is only 1/3 of the excess spending that has happened since Boris Johnson. And I will remind you, and you may agree, but I suspect you will agree with this, the quality of service since that extra 300 billion in almost every respect has declined. So 105 billion is roughly 7% of the total spending budget. It's pretty small beer, and it's a starting point as far as I'm concerned, not an end point. And I think Doug is going to granularly talk about how we achieve that sort of number. We think, though, this country is running a deficit of 160 billion despite record taxes, and has now in excess of 3 trillion of debt, and that's the on-balance sheet debt before the off-balance sheet debt. We have to run a fiscally prudent policy. So our proposal today is that approximately 50% of the 105 billion of savings is recycled into reducing the growth in debt, and the other half is recycled into trying to grow the economy through tax cuts. The only recession in this country really has been in the private sector. So the economy is barely growing, but when the state sector, public sector spending is up 7.9%, you don't need to be a genius to work out what's happening to the private sector. So our specific proposals to reduce, to grow the economy. The first is Britain is hemorrhaging people. It's hemorrhaging good people, people who have made a lot of money in this country. We're losing more millionaires than any other country on the planet, with the exception of China, and proportionately they're losing less. We're also losing about 200,000 young people who are going to Dubai, Australia, wherever. So it's not just at the elite level people are leaving. Just as worryingly, talented people leaving university are leaving this country. And that is clearly a disaster. Our very modest proposal is to make Britain open for business again, and we would revert to the pre-2024 non-dom treatment. We believe that would have a very substantial impact on increasing tax revenues and increasing the cake incrementally over the next 5 to 10 years, an almost instant win, because we just have to be better than Europe, and Europe is pretty bad. Are you going to choose to invest in France? No, I don't think so. Are you going to choose to invest in Germany? No. If we send a signal that we're open for business, very quickly people will come back. Second thing, abolish inheritance tax. The left will say that's outrageous. But actually, lots of countries have no inheritance tax. Just a few: Austria, Hong Kong, communist Hong Kong, Norway, Portugal, Slovakia, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, to name but a few. A number of reasons we believe that this will be actually have a payback of about 4 years before it becomes positive, is that actually it encourages people who are older to work a little bit longer if they want to do that. And the rich are mobile. Why wouldn't you, if you were 75, not go to somewhere where there was no inheritance tax? You need a very small number of people to make that decision for this to be self-funding. Second thing is I want to create or recreate a British Mittelstand. Mittelstand is the German word for the small, middle-sized companies that was the bedrock of the German economy. By abolishing capital gains tax on assets held in businesses for more than 5 years, we will encourage intergenerational business building, and that has largely been lost in this country. Again, we believe in the medium term, this is an incremental reform, increasing employment and prosperity. Critical factor. We've lost that middle-sized business, intergenerational business in this country. Third measure, increase capital allowances. Britain's capital allowances are extremely low relative to most OECD countries. Only 39% of investment is tax deductible. We believe that doubling the allowance on capital building projects will have a material positive impact in the medium term on GDP growth, and we estimate it will increase GDP by 1.9% or 11 billion within 4 years. Most of our measures are designed to grow, all of our measures are designed to grow the cake and be self-funding on a short to medium term basis. Perhaps the most absurd tax of all is stamp duty. When I bought my first house, stamp duty was 1%. It wasn't too bothered about that, but it's now 5, 7, 8, 10, 12%, depending what sort of house you're buying. That is A, illiberal, B, it's an impediment to mobility, and C, it's counterproductive. Yes, it raises £14 billion for the government, but it reduces transactions. What happens when you buy a house? You do up your kitchen, you do up your bathroom, you employ professional fees. The government gets that back in VAT. Different account, but the net sums will be beneficial. So we propose to abolish stamp duty also on equities, on shares. When I started out in the city, London was 9% of the world's stock market. It's about 2.5%, 3%. There's hardly been a significant float, with the possible exception of Raspberry Pi on the London stock market, of an actual British company for a long, long time. Abolishing stamp duty is at the margin. I'm not going to say that's going to suddenly change it, but it is a measure to help boost the city. So all our measures are supply-side measures targeted and to grow the economy. And in actual fact, if you actually add up those sums from those 4 measures, it's far less than the 50 billion that we promised to give you back from the 105 billion, the modest 105 billion of cost cutting. So I think we can do more than this. But what is more, and what I would challenge the Resolution Foundation and other group thinkers, is that these measures will grow the pot. And the biggest single determinant on tax take isn't taking increased taxes, it is growth. You know, each extra 1% of growth is about £30 billion. A third of that in tax is 10 billion. That's a far bigger determinant. And the reason that Rachel Reeves is coming back for more, and if she takes more, as she probably will, she'll be back for more again. She is reducing the pot rather than growing it. And at this point, if I don't drop the rugby ball again, or the football after Scotland's great win, I pass to Doug, who's going to tell you exactly how we're going to do it.
Thank you, Ewan. That was brilliant. Aha, good. Right, so I picked up a different rugby ball this time. Having just written a book with Art Laffer, obviously I'm very much a supporter of the idea that if you cut taxes, you can get more revenue. I think there is a time issue. It doesn't always happen immediately. But if you cut enough taxes at the right time, you'll eventually do noticeably better. Now, let me move on. Ewen's had the fun bit because he's been able to talk about the tax cuts. I'm the bad cop, so to speak, and I'm going to talk mainly about the public spending cuts that you have to do to help us get there. But let me start with the OBR. I was handed this particular pass because I had a role in inventing it. And I know Liz thinks that that means I'm joining the circle of the damned for having set up something that she hasn't found terribly attractive. But that's what we've said in this is unless they can reform the OBR, it has to be abolished. So I think that's the compromise between the two views, as we say. We actually don't think, or at least I don't think, that the OBR itself is the cause of austerity. I actually think it's a bit of a protection. I think Rachel Reeves would have a much tougher job if she didn't have the OBR, because she'd be entirely at the mercy of the bond markets without someone cushioning her from the impact. So I think actually she's probably, her situation is made slightly easier by the existence of the OBR. And I think if we could get the OBR right, it could play that role for other governments as well. But we do need to get it right to do that. It's pretty lousy at forecasting. Now, I've taken a chart from The Spectator, which shows the OBRs, all the OBRs forecast for productivity. Now, you can see what happens. Productivity since 2010 has risen by 6%. They kept on forecasting that it will blue sky and go up in a straight line. Regardless of the regulatory position, regardless of the tax position, they seem to think that productivity is unaffected by these things. Well, the real world knowledge says no, that it is affected by these things. One of their problems is that they are technically constrained by the need to produce a cyclically adjusted forecast, which traps them into the mindset of thinking that we will revert to cyclical trend. And because they tend to think that, they tend to come up with what, frankly, is a bit of nonsense. Their second problem is they're not very good at understanding the behavioral effects of tax changes. This is partly because of the way tax changes are, the effects of tax changes are estimated. The vast majority of them are actually done by HMRC, who may be fairly good at grabbing your income tax, but they really lack the firepower to do proper behavioral economics. They don't have a team to do it. They don't have any specialists, and they have no tradition of doing this. So it's not entirely surprising HMRC do sort of shoebox accounting type analysis rather than something where you actually look at the economic effects. When the OBR actually does address itself, it came up to roughly the same conclusion as we did for migration, for example, where they pointed out eventually, after a lot of pressure, that migration actually reduces GDP per capita, which is an interesting conclusion to come to, and one that they haven't drawn much attention to, partly possibly because of their background and their thinking. The personnel so the processes need to be reformed, but the personnel also need to be reformed. They're drawn from a very tight range of institutions. You need to widen that range. They need to get people who think in very different ways about the economy. You need diversity of thought in the OBR. And our recommendation is that the Treasury Committee oversees ensuring that diversity of thought gets into both the OBR and the MPC. If they can't get that right, then I think Liz will have gloating rights, because I think that the only alternative would be to abolish it. Let me come back to public spending. We've got a range of different things. We reckon it will add up to savings of 105 billion. We've allocated half of that to tax cuts. In fact, because the tax cuts eventually cost nothing, because most of our tax changes that we recommend ultimately make more revenue. These are only initial budgets, so there'll be scope for more budgets within this envelope. This is the first slide I'd really like to draw your attention to. In 2012, there were equal numbers of central and local government staff. Now, for every person working in local government, there are 2 people working in central government. Both the numerator and the denominator have changed. The interesting thing is that the reduction in headcount in local government proves that it's not impossible to cut public spending. The only area where it's proved difficult has been to cut central government spending. And we give some examples of the increases that have taken place. Since June 2016, civil service numbers have risen by 36%. Policy staff by 116%. And they claim it's been caused by Brexit. They've claimed that an extra 17,000 jobs, roughly, have been required by Brexit. I wonder if any of you have any idea how many staff are employed by the United States Trade Representative? Liz, you probably know that. 248. And 248, and bear in mind that they are negotiating more than one trade deal at the moment. So they are actually having quite a lot to do. And yet they still need a fraction of the increase in the staff. That's the increase, not the baseload, that we've had in the civil service. The department with the biggest increase is the Ministry for Fun, the DCMS, where the increase has been 270%, which is sort of quite an impressive thing even just to manage. Or at least it would be if they actually did anything. So there are a lot of suggestions. We've actually taken some from the Tony Blair Institute, believe it or not. We're quite diverse in our sources of information and inspiration. And we've got a range of other tools that are suggested. We think that we can go back to where we were in 2015, which would make a huge saving. Pay and pensions. They're currently rising nearly twice as fast in the public sector. Pay is rising nearly twice as fast in the public sector. The latest figures released last week, 8.3% increase versus private sector, 4.9%. There's been a fairly consistent gap if you go a little bit further back. The odd thing is that actually over a long period, and if you go back to 97, there's been no rise in public sector productivity at all, if you believe the figures, whereas private sector productivity has risen by 60%. Actually, whole economy productivity has risen by 60%, which means the private sector, which has been, since the whole economy has been dragged back by the public sector, the private sector has risen by even more. So the need to pay premium staff, if we're going to reduce the headcount, we're not going to have to pay premium rates to attract people. So there is scope for reducing the favorable pay and pension situation in the public sector and making savings through that. Welfare, special needs, and the state pension. I think we're all fairly aware of the increase in the number on various types of sickness or incapacity benefit, from 2.8 million to 4 million last year, and it's gone up further since. The basic thing that you have to do is assess in person, plan to get them off benefit, set those plans up and monitor them, and expenditure needs to be budgeted. At the moment, there's no incentive to reduce expenditure. They just declare that someone's on benefit, and the Treasury has to send them a check. Now, without budgeting, you can't have responsibility. I know it may seem hard and tough, but particularly when a lot of the claims are generally thought of as fairly marginal, budgeting is, I think, the only way to keep the cost from rising. But this feeds back earlier into the feed chain. There are two forces increasing the number on incapacity benefit. One is adults coming in straight, but the other, which is nearly as big, is if you get onto special needs while you're at school, you get automatically carried through into sickness benefit. And there's no great incentive for you to try and change your status. You get automatic money, so why would you not take it? I mean, and you don't really need to have a big challenging interview to go and do that. We think that our reforms will reduce the cost of sickness benefit. We think it would be hard to make a very sizable saving in special needs if you have to invest more in plans to get children off special needs. We think the main gain from operating on that is you don't have so many people feeding into sickness benefit, adult sickness benefit, which ultimately cost a lot more than special needs costs for children. Let me just come on to the triple lock. It's a good idea in one sense, because UK pensions are actually remarkably low by international standards. But the problem is that, in fact, it leads to people like me getting compensated twice for the same bout of inflation, because they come through in wages first, and then they come through in prices, and you get compensated more than once. I think you just need to link pensions to average earnings. That produces equality in the labour market, and we believe it will make a saving. So we think the combination of these things is what will eventually help us. So those are the different public spending things that we are proposing. We're being very focused this time. Let me move to the supply side regulatory changes. Planning and housing, we've got a whole range of things. The current attempts to improve planning are failing. They're failing because Labour's analysis essentially was that the problem was caused by nasty Tories in the Shire counties who were acting on behalf of the local NIMBYs. I'd make 2 points. First, it's not entirely immoral to act on behalf of local people who fear the impact of increased traffic on the roads, potholes, and all sorts of stress on all sorts of other kinds of services that are not funded. As a result of increased building. I think that if you do increase building in these counties, you do need to ensure that the funding for services goes with them. And the problems are most obvious on the roads, where you get two things. You get the effect of building lorries, which do more. Potholes are a product of the fourth power of the axle weight, as Howard can probably tell you. I mean, there are very few things in real life where you actually don't just square, but you take the fourth power. It's really quite extraordinary. So cars do nothing, but heavy lorries absolutely mess up roads. And that's all planning, engineering experts will tell you this. So when you have building lorries coming along country lanes, they make a hell of a mess. And if you don't get compensation for that, you've got a problem emerging. However, what's actually been going on is the whole slew of planning regulations. There are 3,300 pages of them. Planning regulations, environmental regulations, powers given to different bodies to stop things. You know that Ebbsfleet New Town was stopped by a spider. It wasn't a spider that was anywhere near Ebbsfleet, but it was a spider within a kilometre. And so Natural England concluded that because it was within a kilometre of where the spider was, it was necessary to stop a whole new town because of the potential environmental impact. When you've got that kind of madness, then no wonder we're having difficulty building. We're proposing an Australian zoning system. We're proposing that environmental objectors should have their rights to object curtailed. The shorthand here slightly suggests it's a bit like cutting the tails of dogs. It's not quite as bad as that. But we think their rights should be limited to what is sort of proportionate for what they're doing. Infrastructure planning should be expedited, and some of the government's current proposals for infrastructure aren't entirely silly. But on top of that, there are two other things that need doing. The first is anti-landlord legislation, which I know is started under the Conservatives, but it's a silly policy. If you make it difficult for landlords to rent, they'll reduce the supply of properties. Survey evidence says 25% of the properties currently on the market will be taken off. I'm not sure I fully believe it, but it gives an indication of what landlords are saying. Finally, the most onerous safety provisions that were imposed post-Grenfell Tower. The most onerous one is the requirement that any building over 18 metres high, and it's not 18 metres high from the ground, which would be slightly more logical, it's 18 metres high from the bottom of the building. So it's really from the floor of the basement up to the top. Has to have 2 staircases. As you can imagine, that's put a halt to a large amount of new building, especially in towns. And currently in London, housing starts are the lowest since the 1890s, not the 1990s, the 1890s. I think it's a combination of all these things, difficult to attribute to just one, but it's clear we can do better. Net zero, we're not against the environment, but we do think that it has to be cost justified. That means repealing the uncosted environmental legislation and replacing it with new legislation that allows for environmental improvements to be carried out if they are cost justified. When I was wearing an earlier hat, I did a piece of work for Howard Cox over here, where we showed that the ban on internal combustion engine fueled vehicles in 2030, even using a carbon price of £150, which is nearly 3 times what it actually is, but that was the government number that they were recommending at the time, that still had costs 5 times the benefit. You have to make environmental policy cost efficient, both in the means through which we meet environmental ends and the extent to which we meet the environmental ends. If you do that, you can stop the environment becoming a cost and it becomes a benefit instead, which is what we all want. We're killing manufacturing industry. You see an announcement virtually every day about someone shutting down. It's not entirely surprising because our large industrial unit electricity prices are currently 127% higher even than the EU, which itself is quite high, and around 3 times the cost in each of the US, India, and China. And you wonder why people don't want to make chemicals in the UK. Finally, on the supply side, the labour market and the minimum wage. First of all, scrap the Employment Right Bill. We've calculated how much it will damage the economy. It simply is not appropriate, particularly now. You need to eliminate restrictions on overtime work. We've already said we need to encourage people to work. Allowing dismissal more easily if business conditions require it, because if they can't dismiss people, they won't hire people. And adjust the minimum wage to the normal level elsewhere in the world as a percentage of the median wage. That's typically 60%. Ours is currently 67%. Obviously, don't reduce the minimum wage. Do it by freezing it. It's the easy way of achieving the result. And eventually, we'll become into line with the rest of the world. 60% is a fairly reasonable minimum wage level. We've worked out it will boost GDP ultimately by 18%. But rather more importantly, we're trying to do Rachel Reeves a favor and save her career. We're offering things where the economic effects are at the beginning, especially at the beginning. Normally when you do supply-side reforms, they start off very low and they build up in years 5 to 10. We've tried this time to optimize those things that work in years 0 to 5, to try and get some growth in the economy immediately. I think it's not just a political requirement. I think it's an economic requirement. Because I think to rekindle confidence in the UK, we need to get some growth going quickly. I don't think we can just keep waiting. And this chart came from my book, the book I wrote with Art Laffer, Prosperity Through Growth, but it was carried out by Nina's team at CEBR. It showed where the UK would be on current trends, obviously not written in stone, because of course once you start falling down the league table, the best players tend to leave, and so you actually start falling down the league tables even faster. We reckon we just about hold steady. Now, given that other countries are doing well, that's not a bad result. There's nothing wrong with other countries doing well. It's just when you get a result as a combination of us doing really badly and them doing well, that we need to start getting worried about ourselves. So that's what we propose. Remember, all is not lost. We've got significant growth in what I used to call the flat white economy. Over the last 12 months, that's grown by 4.1%. exports of services in real terms have grown by 6.1%. And investment in plant and machinery, which is mainly IT kit, has grown by 9% in real terms over the past 12 months. There are bits of the economy that are performing well, and with AI have the potential to perform even better. But to take advantage of all these things, we need to get both the supply side right, taxes down, we need flexible labour markets. Roughly half the jobs in the economy will probably be destroyed or radically changed by AI. The job destruction is probably written in. Most technological changes have created more jobs than they've destroyed. For that to happen in the UK this time, we need to have the right policies to make it happen, and that's what we're putting forward. Now, thank you very much. You've all been very patient. None of you have tapped your watches to see if they've stopped, so thank you for that. And we're open for questions and answers.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Ewan. It is indeed time for questions from you in the audience. Please raise your hands, and if you there's a microphone that will come to you, and if you can identify who you are, where you're from, that would be helpful. There was a hand from a gentleman. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen Brenton. The Conservative Party has proposed 47 billion of cuts, whereas the Growth Commission has proposed 105 billion, and you say you're lowballing at 105 billion. So that's a difference of 58 billion. Does that mean you're actually doing the same cuts but deeper, or are you proposing something completely different?
Shall I take that one? Thank you for the question. I mean, I think the periods are slightly different, so it's not an exactly fair comparison. But in general, we are going further on most things. We're particularly going further on central government. I think having done the analysis of splitting up central and local government, at understanding the extent of the overmanning in central government, it encourages us to be a bit more radical.
I would also, I don't know if my mic is working or not, but add 105 billion sounds a lot of money, but it is, as I mentioned in my talk, just a third of the increase we've seen. And you can see, I think the killer chart in the whole presentation is Doug's chart on the growth in public sector employment, central government employment, while actually local government employment has fallen. There is a huge amount of cost that can be taken out. So, you know, I would encourage the Conservative Party and Reform to look very closely. And much of this is line by line, actually. And actually, only when you're in government do you really see the degree of inefficiency. But some of these inefficiencies are extraordinary. Your stat on the 240 odd people that work in trade in the US, you contrast that with the numbers in the UK, it's tenfold the difference, literally.
Thank you. I'd say the big difference between the UK and the US and USTR or the UK Trade Department is that elected officials control the budgets in the US. In Britain, unelected, unaccountable civil servants who can't be hired and fired control the budgets. So you're not fundamentally going to be able to change central government until you change that fundamental fact. And the Prime Minister is able to appoint the permanent secretaries and the people that report to them. And I just wanted to sort of comment on Doug's point about the Office of Budget Responsibility. There are two problems with it. One is the makeup of the people themselves, and also the legality they operate within. So they have to justify every single line in their forecast. So for example, one of the reasons the forecast moved recently was gilt rates, and the fact that gilt rates over a 20-day period were different. Now, if that had been a private forecaster like CBR, you would have been able to say, well, this is what I kind of think, maybe it could change this way, and I'm going to make a slight change. They can't do that because they know they're going to be questioned about where they got the number from. So it's become painting by numbers. But the other issue is, when the Chancellor is actually coming up with the budget now, they don't have forecasters inside the Treasury. So they're not actually developing tax policy or spending policy or supply side policy with a forecaster, because they literally have to wait for the OBR to send stuff every 2 weeks. It is a completely mad process, which anybody who has been in number 10 or the Treasury knows. And it simply doesn't work. And so there are two different things that need to be changed about the system. And I just say to everybody, I completely agree with vast majority of recommendations here, but many people in the Conservative government from the period of 2010 to 2024 basically agreed with that. The issue is, how on earth do you get it done in the current system, and what do you have to change about the system itself?
Prime Minister, I think we completely agree with your analysis. We've come up with policy recommendations here, but the easy part is making the recommendations. The difficult part is implementing them. And I think, the advice you've given on the necessity of bringing permanent secretaries under political control, the requirement to be able to hire and fire in a reasonable fashion civil servants, the requirement to bring the 500 billion of Quango spending under direct ministerial control, plus many other reforms, is an absolutely urgent task. I don't know, Doug, if you want to say something about the OBR or...
A very quick comment, because I've already had my say on the OBR, and I don't think it serves its purpose to say it twice. We made it very clear that if our recommended reforms don't take place, it has to be abolished. So I don't think we're that far apart, in reality. You've persuaded me.
Just one other thing on the OBR. Its budget's £50 million. They employ 50 or 60 economists. When I worked for Dresner Climate Benson or Hall Gavette, pretty eminent city firms, they never employed 4 economists, and their forecasting was somewhat better.
And they did a new forecast every month. And Nina, Sam, you produce a new forecast every month. And I don't think you've got 52 permanent staff, and I don't think you've got a budget of 50 million. Unless the numbers of...
We're aiming for it now,
Yeah, I realise you've done a lot better with the company than I did, Nina, but I don't think you've done that well.
Gentleman picture.
Hi, thank you. First of all, on Quangos, I believe Quangos control roughly about 500 billion of public sector spending. And I think, do you think that there's a real opportunity for a complete overhaul of Quangos to actually look at that 500 billion and see how we can allocate that more efficiently and actually that's useful? Because Quangos are completely unaccountable and are not doing us any good at the moment. And secondly, if I may, on property taxes, does your proposal to abolish stamp duty account for primary residences or all residences? And if I may, on mansion taxes, do you think that how catastrophic do you think that could be?
Well, I deal with Quangos, and do you want to deal with the property? Is that?
Or should we do it the other way around?
Okay, you do it the other way around. Yeah, okay, you go for the Quangos.
I mean, I think your number's slightly on the high side, but I mean, the argument about the numbers is silly, because we can always look it up in the book. The basic point you make is a totally valid one, which is the idea was you'd have entirely independent people. What you ended up with is not independent people at all, but Treasury-appointed people who tended to respond to the same groupthink rules as the rest of the Treasury and most of the rest of the public sector. I think once you establish that, there's no great point in a Quango, because all it does is it has power without responsibility. And as you know, that's a prerogative of, we probably shouldn't talk about it.
In terms of property taxes, firmly of the view that stamp duty gums up the system. It gums up transactions. It's counterproductive. It hits the building industry. It hits professional services industries. I think it has a negative net raise, actually, and I think it has the same impact on the City of London in terms of share trading. The second, I'm an economic liberal. I think ownership of property goes to the cornerstone of our civilization. It's up to you what you want to do. If you want to own no houses, one house, or several houses, that's your call. So I wouldn't differentiate between the two. In terms of a mansion tax, it's a dumb tax. If it's set at 2 million for the sake of argument, those £2 million houses won't be worth 2 million for very long. In the 1970s, rates were exceptionally high and valuable property was not valuable. And in actual fact, it hit the state. It's a counterproductive tax. We need to clear it away.
Down up front, Johnny.
Thank you, John Yarcraft. I'm not an economist. I run a private business, but my family was involved in technological change back in 1770 when we built the first mechanised factory. So I'm passionate about technological change and the impact it can make with my work as well. Simple maths. If you put a deficit of 160 billion, we're making savings of 105 billion, and you're giving half that back in tax cuts. Surely you've still got 100 billion, you're short of 100 billion until the growth provides the remedies. Does that not mean that your national deficit is going to go on going up for a number of years until, can you not be more dramatic about these cuts and get on with it quicker?
You might be, but we've costed it quite carefully. Remember, there's an ongoing reduction built in. If the government were to stick to its plans, there would be some, not a huge reduction in the deficit, but there's some already taking place. Now, what we're also forecasting is much faster GDP growth. And the impact of the GDP growth taken together means that the deficit as a share of GDP falls fairly dramatically if we adopt our policies. In fact, so dramatically that there's scope for more tax cuts within the envelope. So we don't think it's a problem. We're keen to make sure that we have stable finances. It's our starting point, number one, where we start from now. And number two, we believe the international economy is getting really sick of large amounts of government stock from all countries, not just us, being shoved into the bond markets. And we have a suspicion that within the foreseeable time frame, and always give a forecast or give a time frame, but try not to give both at the same time. It's hard to say when this will happen, but we are worried that at some point, the bond market's going to say enough is enough. And so we think it is important to get the bond market share down fairly considerably. It doesn't have to be reduced immediately to zero, but it does have to be reduced, and we've aimed at this 50 billion reduction.
It's a fine judgment as well. I mean, I have some sympathy with going big, but the trouble is if you go big, you risk actually, because the state's become such a large entity in the economy, you risk quite a serious recession. Whoever's in power in 2028, 29 has got 5 years to provide hope, So I think people might be prepared to take a little bit of pain in the short term, but after 3 or 4 years, they must be seeing those green shoots coming forward. Your maths is not wrong. In fact, I'd say it's spot on. But I think to Doug's point, if we can get the growth going from, frankly, under 1% per capita to 2.5%, which I think we can do, that deficit comes down very quickly, and we'd come back for more. But it's a value judgment how aggressive to be. I think we have done it at certainly twice as aggressively as the Conservative Party is currently proposing. But could we have gone bigger? Yes, we possibly could. But I think it's a realistic proposal, which I think is achievable.
If your plan is so good, why not do twice as much? And that's a very logical argument. We tried to make a judgment between what is feasible and what would also make sure that we do get some growth in the short term, because we think if the economy carries on stagnating, we think a lot of people will lose hope.
My vision is it would take 20 years, is to get us back to about a third of the economy being the state, where we were 20 or 30 years ago. You can't do that overnight without, Milei is trying very hard in Argentina, but he's coming from a much, much worse position than we're in. But I think we can do it, actually. If we prove this works, and I'm sure it will work, Margaret Thatcher, when she won in 79, was actually quite cautious initially. But it's when she showed it worked, she was able to come back again and again and again, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Catherine.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to everything happening. But I wanted to know if you were taking into account the fact that I think we're spending about 120 billion on interest rates at the moment. And when Sunak blew out the money supply, he actually did it in 5-year bonds, which are now expiring and maturing and have to be rolled over. And that is what's killing our economy. The good news is if you do cut the 100 billion out of spending, you're also going to cut that interest rate bill, which will probably get, maybe not the whole extra 100, but it must surely get you somewhere. Did you take that into account or did you not?
Model that does these things. I mean, I'm not saying that models are perfect. I mean, Sam built the model, so it must be very good. But no model is perfect. They're all they're built up from the assumptions that are fed into them. But at least they try and make things consistent. So if you have a smaller deficit, you pay less debt interest. So it is built in, but that's as far as I would go. I don't promise we're right.
One other point on that, I mean, George Osborne in his wisdom raised a third of the gilts on index-linked gilts, which might have been fine when inflation was zero. It's not fine when inflation is high. So it is a very important part of the matrix that there is monetary stability, because it's not just the level of debt, it's the level of inflation that has to be, feeds through on interest payments. But your basic point is right, 120 billion on interest repayment, more than the education budget, twice the defence budget, not great.
That's in your numbers?
It is in the numbers, yeah.
Thank you, Nina Scaro from CBR. Which of your proposed, as if I wasn't loud enough already, okay. Which of your proposed policies do you suspect would garner most enthusiasm publicly? So not sort of amongst economists, forecasters, but you mentioned, Doug, a moment ago, sort of a general loss of hope. I think for a lot of us living in the UK, we've noticed that day to day. Which ones do you think, I mean, in general, it seems that reforms need to be publicly popular as well as sort of, fiscally prudent to gather support. Which ones do you think would be kind of big headline grabbing, enthusiasm raising ones?
I would imagine sacking civil servants would grab a lot of enthusiasm, except with one group. The way I see it, I'm trying to see it from Rachel Reeves' perspective. She's bound to be unpopular, whatever she does, on November the 26th. But if she builds up this unpopularity and still doesn't solve the problem, I don't think she'll be coming back for more. Her successor may be coming back for more. Who knows what excuses they use? Will they blame it? They can't say Brexit again. It would probably have to be World War II, World War I, maybe the Battle of Hastings. Or possibly a dog broke into HMRC and ate the revenues. I mean, they're running out of excuses, essentially. And I think it would be very hard for her to come back if she hasn't had an effect. So I think whatever budget is introduced this autumn is going to be an unpopular budget. But there isn't an election next year, although we hope there would be. It's fairly unlikely to be an election. The election probably because these guys are bound to lose their seats, and so they're not going to give up a cushy job easily if they think they can go and get paid and pensions and so on for a few more years. So I don't think there'll be an election all that soon. So that means the election's probably in 29. And that's the time you have to be popular. Being popular today is A, not an option, and B, not what it's actually about, because there isn't an election today. And so I think that's where Rachel Reeves needs to focus. A little anecdote. In 1980, I was called over to the States by the Reagan people to deliver a paper at a conference on what Mrs. Thatcher had done and how the prospects were. They wanted to try and optimize what they were doing to take account of the experience in the UK. And my conclusion was her difficulty would be getting through the first election, because most of these measures would deliver a payoff between 5 and 10 years, but they wouldn't necessarily do a big enough one in 4 or 5 years to make her instantly popular. Now, General Galtieri solved that problem. But that is the difficulty. That's why we really optimize things to get some growth in the next 5 years, and it's quite hard with supply-side policy to do that. If you do the right thing, most of the best policies are ones that will give their return years 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, round about then. This time we've tried a different tack. We're trying to optimize, and it's a little bit easier because of the mistakes in the last budget. You just repeal those and you're already on a good wicket, so to speak. If you get these things right, you will get growth, and there may be some popularity in 4 or 5 years' time. And I'm no good at political forecasting. I think I'm okay at economic forecasting. And I think it's the economy that will make the difference.
Yeah, I mean, the decline of Britain is 30 years in the making, at least. You know, Rachel Reeves is the icing on the cake. She's done everything wrong. She's increased public spending 7.9%. She's raised taxes, particularly on employment. So she's made matters worse, but it's completely not realistic to say that our problems are entirely down to her. They've catastrophic decisions from the Conservative Party since 2010, who sold the pass. But the architecture of this legal, bureaucratic, anti-democratic state comes down to Tony Blair, as Liz absolutely rightly says. So we cannot solve this country's problems in 5 years. This is a 20-year turnaround plan. But what I think we can do is we can give hope. And I think there's enough good people in this country who will respond to that hope. You know, most of Europe is a basket case. The only part of Europe doing reasonably well is Eastern Europe and maybe Italy. Most of the rest of it is not. If we can change that delta very quickly, there'll be some hope and growth will start to reoccur. There might be a couple of difficult years because, of course, even however unproductive these civil servants are, and they are unproductive, if they lose their £100,000 a year job or whatever they're paid, they'll find it extremely difficult to get something in the private sector. So there will be a short term. The only reason the economy is not growing at all, okay, it's been, consider this, since you founded a company, your 250 years ago, the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. Since that forefront, Britain's per capita growth down to innovation has been roughly 2.5% per annum. The line just is straight, you know, until 2010. Since 2010, growth has been about 0.5%, and since 2020, it's been about 0 per capita, okay? So this is an extraordinary period of underperformance. People in the country are realizing things are seriously wrong. We don't all agree why it's wrong. I think most people in this room have a pretty good understanding of it. But there are tried and tested measures that work. And that is effectively trusting the people to innovate and not centralizing. And what we have done is we have moved from a pretty productive private sector to an unbelievably unproductive public sector. I was talking to a gentleman here earlier about HS2, probably one of your favorite subjects. It's going to cost more than 100 billion, okay? But let's just say it costs 100 billion to knock 15 minutes off the train journey to Birmingham. Let's just say it costs 100 billion. If that was a private sector project, you'd require a minimum return of capital of 10% on that project, a minimum. So you'd have to make profits of £10 billion a year. I will bet you when HS2 opens, it still requires subsidy. So this is an example of the state. No private sector company would ever have built that, of the state spending vast sums of money uncompetitively, and the chickens are coming home to roost, and there is no growth. And if you want my bet, Rachel Reeves will raise more taxes, she'll centralize, she'll spend on the Green Investment Bank or whatever other silly idea she's got, and she might just about keep the show on the road with growth at roughly 0.5% or 0 or 1% or whatever it might be. Pathetic number, by the way, relative to other countries. But it is the management of utter decline, and it's making it worse and harder to recover. So it's a matter of judgment how big we go. For what it's worth, I think we have to go fairly big. I think our numbers are reasonably big. But I think they will start to turn the tank around, and I think that will give people hope, and that will feed on itself, and we can go again.
Roger?
Thank you. Roger Ewald, broadcaster, and in the city. I'm curious why you've left out one measure that would be very easy win. I talk about this all the time so much that the television and radio networks that I'm on have told me to shut up, it's boring. The only other person who I've heard mention it once or twice is Richard Tice, but nothing's gone after that. Dead simple. Raising the tax threshold from 12,570 to 20,000 is about 47 billion a year. That's pretty much exactly the amount of interest that we pay on the fake quantitative easing printed money. Unlike Switzerland, unlike the European Central Bank, unlike most other countries in the world, they don't pay interest to the banks who don't need the money because they've had 14 interest rate rises from Mr. Bailey. Successive governments ignore this one after the other, and I'm, with respect, disappointed that this isn't one item on your agenda.
I have some sympathy with what you're saying, actually. You're right. The ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the Swiss Federal Bank don't pay interest on QE money. I'm a skeptic on QE generally, and I think certainly the COVID QE had a 400 billion of a significant impact on inflation.
Increased and prolonged the inflation that Bailey said he was, and Sunak said they were cutting.
We're on the same page. Bailey said there was going to be deflation after COVID. In fact, the chairman of the Fed said exactly the same thing. The chairman of the ECB said the same thing. They believed, or they publicly said at least, there would be deflation. But anyone that looked at the growth in the money supply could have seen that inflation was on the way. Unfortunately, that's not what they look at any longer. So I think we're absolutely on the same page. What Britain is also doing is it's booking losses as it QTs on its free money. It's a ridiculous accounting trick because they paid nothing for this debt in the first place, and then they're marking to market and claiming there's a loss. So I think Richard Tice is on a strong wicket on this, actually, and I have a lot of sympathy with what you're arguing. The problem is it's quite a technical subject and it's not sexy. But it doesn't make it any more. I think you're right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And well, City AM identified me as the one who called him the Bailey-osaurus because he won't listen to anybody. I personally believe that he pushed somebody very special sitting not very far from me here off the edge of a cliff because she was right and he was wrong.
Yeah.
But that's another point that you raised about the groupthink. Now, I'd just like to add that the Lords Select Committee said the Bank of England is using defective software, their methods are outmoded, and their view of diversity is non-white people, not different ideas.
Yeah.
They suffered from all of that, and Bailey responded by getting Ben Bernanke over rather than Andy Haldane, their own economist. Bernanke, his friend from the United States, the man who didn't spot the 2008 financial crisis coming for $700 billion, it brought him over to back him up. And he actually turned on him and said, I'm sorry, I agree with the Lords that your software is defective, your methods are outmoded, there's no groupthink, same thing. And nothing's been done about that either because of the independence that they have. So this is something that these two things, successive governments could have had big wins by doing something about them, but nobody ever has.
We quote the Bernanke report and precisely what you've just said in the growth budget. I can find you the page, or Ewen will find you the page. Yeah. While I speak, that's probably the way to do it. We actually quote this. It's even worse than you say. Do you know the Bank of England spends about the same amount as the entire Economic and Social Research Council on research every year? Thank you. It's on page 11. So please look at that. I think we're on the same page on this one. But it's even worse because the bank spends, I'd say, roughly half the total spending on economic research in the country. And they've completely failed to keep up to speed with their forecasting techniques. They've completely failed to focus on things like monetary policy. Instead, they've been self-indulgent. And, sorry. They've been self-indulgent. And I would guess most of their money is wasted. What I've also noticed is the massive increase in work on climate change. If you can't do your day job properly, do not take on other jobs until you've sorted out what you got wrong.
The cherry on it all is the Bailey Ossos, you'll recall, telling British companies, that Mittelstand, not to make profits. Do you remember that? Because it will fuel inflation, at the same time as he gave out 25 million in rises to his staff.
He's a former member of the Fabian Society. So, I mean, I think the difficulty with blaming him for all the things that went wrong is it's very difficult to distinguish between Bank of England malevolence and Bank of England incompetence, at least if you look at the results, because they end up the same. And I think Bank of England incompetence is a factor you have to build in.
I'm going to grade them very low on malevolence. I think they're way up there on incompetence.
I think Liz wanted to come in.
I think Liz has got a different view.
I just want to say that really in response to Roger's point about why this isn't challenged by the system, well, I sought to challenge the Bank of England and I found out that they very rapidly undermined me, and they have huge power with the banks, with the financial establishment, with the media. So you will find very little criticism of the Bank of England in the media. Anybody questioning the Bank of England's policies gets told off because they're independent. But they have become more unsackable than the Prime Minister or the Chancellor. I mean, the Bank of England governor is appointed for 8 years, and they can only be sacked for gross negligence. That's the, they're not fundamentally accountable. And I think if you look at what's going on with the Federal Reserve or what's going on with the ECB, you see the same tendencies. And actually, one of the stories of the past 30 years is the failure of central banks. The failure of central banks after the financial crisis, the massive asset inflation we've seen, the impact that's had on the younger generation being able to get on the housing ladder. And yet there is very little media discussion about the role of the bank.
Quite.
It's a huge problem.
The only way you get sacked if you're a senior official of the Bank of England is for doing what Rupert Pennet-Ray did.
Time for a final round of questions, and I'll take the remaining questions as a clutch, and Doug and Ewen can respond accordingly. I could see 3 hands around this side. If you want to pass the mic, I think those are the final 3. So those in succession, please.
Hello, my name is Laura Wells and I work at Cadent Gas. I think I'm right in saying that we've been in a balance of payments deficit since 1984. Given that you're saying that we've got a services export growth, but also Poland is probably going to overtake us, and everyone in Poland speaks 3 languages, why would you put your services here instead of in Poland? And instead, if we want to, is it worth addressing that the balance of payments deficit? Is it worth targeting getting back to a more even keel or even a balance of payments surplus? And if so, would you recommend looking at some of the ways in which we can protect innovative British businesses that are currently selling their IP to the Germans so that the Chinese don't nick it?
Beyond the £100 billion of cuts you've announced today that you recommend, what other areas do you think spending cuts could be made in to go further to reduce the growth and spending we've seen since 2020?
Thanks very much. I'm Diana Barron. I sit in the House of Lords. 2 questions. One is just to clarify the 4 million central government employees. You pulled out the civil service. I'm assuming the NHS is the other big thing, but I just wondered whether there are other big buckets, just to try and conceptualize what that looks like. My other question is your thinking on improving access to capital for our growth businesses, particularly thinking about how little our pension funds invest in UK equities. I know you mentioned stamp duty, but I wondered if there were other measures you were thinking about. Thank you.
Last one, because I've actually been looking at the numbers. The NHS is 1.25 million at the moment of the 4 million in central government. The civil service is roughly the same in broad size. Then the rest is all sorts of bits and pieces, and there is no huge single item that is sort of significant like the NHS and the civil service. So that's, that gives you some idea of the scale. Of the 1.25 million increase, only 250,000 has actually come from the NHS, which surprised me when I saw the figures, because I thought the big driving force had been the NHS. But no, it turns out to be the civil service, oddly. So that's why I think the one popular thing that anyone could announce in the next week would be bringing the civil service down to scale. I'm sorry, it's harsh if you are a civil servant, and I married a lady who was a civil servant, so I get, whenever I talk about this at home, I get an earful, so that's why I talk about it when I'm not at home. The other one I'd like to take on is the service exports, if I may, and I slightly conjoin it with access to capital. I identified something called the flat white economy 10 years ago, and I showed that what was happening in East London was amazing, and already even by then, in terms of job numbers, it had overtaken the City of London. It came from an insight I had when I worked for IBM, that actually the jobs growth from technology tends not to be in technology companies. And I think that's something the city often get wrong. It's much more in the companies that can use the technology. And so the growth in the East End is about marketing companies, online marketing, doing all sorts of things like that, online advertising, all sorts of sort of odd things, with the core skill is creativity. And for some reason, the Brits just seem to be bloody good at it. Possibly because we're not all Brits. I mean, lots of people are worried about immigration, and there are certainly real concerns about the total scale. But one of the advantages of the East End of London is you get a very cosmopolitan labour force. And I would argue that when people change countries, at least if they're reasonably creative to start off with, they actually get a boost in creativity. And not only that, but when they work with other people, they boost their creativity because they have to keep up. And so I think we get quite a gain from that. And it is almost unique in the UK, compared with other countries, that we have more of this than there seems to be anywhere else. And that's partly why our service exports have done so well. I mean, if you want people who speak lots of languages, you go to the UK, not because the native Brits necessarily are good at languages, but because you know that you can find someone who speaks probably one of 300 different languages in London fairly easily. And I do think that that is a strength that goes with some of the other issues that are associated with migration. So I do think that there is quite a lot that can be done there. As far as funding for new enterprises are concerned, the scale of the growth in the tech side is still noticeably bigger in the UK than elsewhere. I'm sure it can be improved, and I would not want to pretend that the situation was easy. I sense that the biggest gaps are at the very small end, where the cost of due diligence is horrific. Because the cost of due diligence is horrific, what they end up by doing is really putting on massive covenants on people investing in small businesses, and it makes it quite hard for them to do so. And that is a problem that has to be worked out, but government intervention is not normally the best way of trying to achieve that. But there's a lot of external money that is available to invest, particularly in tech and particularly at the moment. Now, maybe there'll be an AI crash, in which case that will disappear for a while. But actually, the sort of tech that Britain is good at is using tech rather than always inventing tech. And so I think that there is something that we probably have going for us there that can potentially be leveraged into creating growth for the whole economy.
You also talked about the current account deficit. You're right. We've run a deficit for 20 or 30 years, forever, pretty well. Many European countries actually do run a surplus. I'm wary about industrial policy. as a general idea. I mean, Britain's manufacturing is in structural decline for a number of reasons. High energy costs, massive regulation, very high minimum wage. We're not going to turn around Britain's manufacturing base overnight, and it's about comparative advantage, actually. And that's why the service sector is doing very well. Yes, I'd love to see our manufacturing sector dramatically more powerful than it is at the moment, but let's not direct that from the centre. Let's actually get it right, bottom up, by having efficient energy prices, and there's no reason we can't have very efficient energy prices. There's no reason why our regulation can't be much more effective. And mixing our metaphors with the second question about what areas would we cut, and just talking about regulation at the same time. Take the Financial Conduct Authority. I like to ask people what they think it costs to run the Financial Conduct Authority. I might have guessed 20 million. Actually, it's 700 million. Okay, 700 million. It's worse than that because that's one regulator. There's the Bank of England. There's the various Treasury regulators. We're spending about 4 billion on financial services regulation. That regulation actually puts a spanner in the works. So it is regularly directing companies to increase their cost base. You pay for that. One of my chums is a wealth manager. They reckon 18% of their costs are now compliance. They have to pass that on to you guys. We've reached this, and that's just one industry. You look at what's happened in industry, look at the employment law that you were talking about in the presentation, which Britain has gone from being a relatively liberal country. And of course, who doesn't want to be nice to employees and give them a high minimum wage and all sorts of never sack them? But the contrary to doing that is you don't create jobs. So look at America's job creation relative to our own. It's chalk and cheese. So we have created a cuddly world, which is actually, in the global context, ridiculous. And it is utterly hollowing out our industrial base. And in time, it does risk actually undermining our service base as well. We may have strategic advantage there at the moment, but to the questioner, Poland and other places are catching up. I think I share the premise of your question that there's a lot more we can go for. Financial Conduct Authority is one small example. Doug's talked about the huge increase in public sector employment. The really, really big area, though, is social protection. We're spending 360 billion on social protection. There's two elements to that 360 billion. Roughly half of that is the old age pension. I share Doug's view that the triple lock is nice, but probably not affordable. And I think we also have to be honest here. The country is in a really serious problem. The pain's got to be shared. You can't just put the pain onto one group, So, but we have got to address the 9.1 million people. It's not just the ONS say 5% are unemployed. Yeah, right. 9.1 million people of working age are not working. And I haven't got the numbers at the top of my head, but there's something like 160 billion is spent in benefits to people of working age. These are enormous sums of money, and since COVID have been increasing exponentially. I completely get the difficulty in assessing who might have ADHD or whatever you call it and who might not. There's a grey area there. But it beggars belief that a fit and healthy country should have 9.1 million people working. And it's not good for someone to sit surfing Netflix all day. And I don't really see why society, other than people who are genuinely ill, should fund that. So there is an enormous amount that can be taken out of the welfare budget, which is in structural growth.
And maybe very boring and quote one more statistic. All these regulators that Ewen talks about, they're all adding cost. I was told at a Lord Mayor's dinner, sorry to drop names, that for Goldman's, the cost of onboarding a customer in Hong Kong is $70. The cost of onboarding a customer in London is $10,000. These are just regulatory costs created by your army of regulators that Ewan's been talking about. So I mean, even as the guys sat at their desks and did nothing, they'd still be improving life. But actually, if we could sack them as well, we'd get a double gain.
Dubai is going to, if you actually look at the league table of floats on global stock markets, and I encourage you to do so, Britain is now about 20th or 30th in terms of new capital raised in London. Money is moving to Dubai and the Middle East and Asia at an alarming rate. And what Doug is talking about is part of it.
On that note, I will bring things to a close. I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you found it a valuable nearly hour and a half of your time. It's been a really useful discussion, really useful. I'd like to particularly thank all our friends at the Centre for Social Justice who have hosted us here today for their help and hospitality in making things run so smoothly. I'd also like to thank Growth Commission donors, because none of what the Growth Commission does would be possible without your support. So thank you if you are already a donor, and if you're not already a donor and would like to consider becoming one, I'd be very happy to have a conversation with you about how you can help. I'd like to conclude by inviting you to thank our commissioners in the usual way.